Hello, so I want to show you how to make a nice, easy fade transition between rooms in GameMaker that's gonna look a little something like this. Nice, smooth transition between rooms. It's really clean, looks really good. Okay, so let's get started. We'll make our new project. Gonna call this fade tutorial. Now, the first thing we're gonna wanna do is set up our rooms, because if we are going to be making a transition, we obviously need to have two rooms to transition between. So let's go into the first room, and just to make it obvious when the transition is going to happen, since it's going to be a fade through black transition, let's make the background for the rooms themselves something a little bit brighter. So the first one can be like a light blue color. It's not a very nice blue, I don't like that. That'll do. And then let's make a new room, create room. The background for this one should be a different color so we can actually tell that we've gone into a new room. Let's make it orange or yellow. Great. So we've got our two rooms. So the way that this transition is going to work is we are going to draw a black rectangle across the entire screen, which fades up in opacity and then fades down in opacity. And right in the middle there, it's gonna change the room. So it's gonna look seamless. It's gonna look great. So to do that, let's create an object. I'm gonna call it object fade. Now, a very important note is that down here, we need to click persistent to be on, because like it says there, instances of this object will persist between rooms. If that was turned off, then we wouldn't have our fade in to the next room nice and smooth. It would just, because the object gets deleted as soon as you go into the next room. So if the object is persistent, then it will still exist in this one and then into that one, which is important. And it obviously needs to be visible so that you can see the rectangle, the black rectangle that we draw. Speaking of which, let's actually do that. So a lot of this code is actually going to be in the draw event. The the object itself isn't going to have a sprite, because we're going to be drawing the rectangle inside of this draw event. So let's get this open. Now, our first step is to draw the rectangle. And oops, there is a fantastic function which does exactly that, and it's called draw rectangle. So the, what's this called? The arguments that you need is two coordinates. You need the x and y of the first position, so that'll be one corner of the rectangle, and then x2 and y2 is the opposite corner of the rectangle. And then you can see here outline. This is true or false, whether you want the rectangle to just be an outline only, or if you want it to be fully filled in, then outline will be false. So let's do that. Top left of the rectangle is going to be the top left of the room, which is 0, 0. And then the bottom right is the second coordinate, and the bottom right of the coordinates for that will be the x is room width, and the y is room height. So it's quite simple. And then outline is false because we want the rectangle to be fully filled in. So now let's place this object into the room and we should expect it to be drawing this rectangle across the entire room. So room 0 is the first room, and now let's play test this. Okay, so you can see the whole screen's white, so that's going to be the next thing that we need to change. We want it to be black. Very simple to do that. Go back into our object, and before you draw the rectangle, we're going to set the color to black. So draw, set color, C black is how we do that. I'm going to test it again. It's always good to test it to make sure that everything is going according to plan. And there you have it, a black rectangle. So the next thing that we're going to work on is the fade itself. So in order to do this, basically we're going to set the opacity to 0 as soon as this object is created, and then it will gradually go up to 1, and whenever it hits 1, we'll go to the next room, and then we will start decreasing the opacity again. In order to do this, we're going to need a couple of variables, and we will initialize them in the create event. So let's do this. We're going to have one variable that will store the opacity for the rectangle, and we can just call it opacity, and it's going to start at 0 because it wants it to be invisible and then fade into black. So to begin with, the opacity will be 0, and the next variable is going to be the amount that we increase the opacity every frame, and I'm going to call that fade amount, and this needs to be a very small number. It needs to be like a fraction of 1, because the opacity goes between 0 and 1, and this is going to increase every frame. So it needs to be a small number to make the fade more gradual. And if you want the fade to be more sudden, then you can increase this number. So I'm going to make it 0.01, and we'll see how that looks whenever we get to testing it. So our variables are ready. Let's go back into the draw event. So in case you didn't know already, the draw event is similar to the step event in that it gets called once per frame, and that's just useful to know. So now we're going to use the opacity variable to actually change the opacity of the rectangle. We want to set the opacity before we draw the rectangle, so it should go above, and we're going to use the function draw set alpha. Alpha basically means the same thing as opacity. And then in here, it's going to go between 0 and 1. 1 will be fully opaque, and 0 is completely invisible. So if we put the opacity variable in there, then as we increase the opacity, the alpha is going to increase, which is great. So we can quickly test to make sure that this is now invisible. Since we set opacity to 0, now the rectangle is not visible. So now, to get the rectangle to fade in, we're just going to increase the opacity by the fade amount. So after we've drawn the rectangle, we're going to increment the opacity. Opacity plus equals fade amount. Oops, that's not how I did it. Fade amount. There we go. So now this is going to fade the rectangle in as soon as we start the game. Like that. Looks pretty nice. Now, one slight issue with this is that this is going to keep increasing beyond 1, And although that doesn't actually have any effect on how it looks, whenever we start decreasing again, it's going to take a while for the alpha to get back to 1 and then to 0. So it will look like nothing's happening. So to make sure that this doesn't go above 1, we can use a clamp. So instead of saying plus equals fade amount, I'm going to say opacity equals opacity plus fade amount. And then where does the clamp come in? The clamp will go before this, and then you open this up into brackets. And down here you can see the value. So that's the value we want to set. We want to increase opacity by fade amount. And then we set a minimum and a maximum value that this can be. So we want that to go between 0 and 1. So the next thing we need to do is whenever the rectangle is fully black, we will go to the next room and then start decreasing that opacity and fade away. So we're going to use an if statement here to check if the opacity has reached 1. So if opacity is 1, then we want to go to the next room. So room, go to next. And also what we want to happen is we want to start decreasing the opacity. A nice little trick to do that is we can just turn this fade amount, which was 0.01, into a minus. So we just multiply it by -1. Fade amount times equals -1. And then this sum here is going to be opacity plus the negative now. So it's going to start going down again. So we can test that. And just like that, you have a fade transition. So now that we've transitioned into the second room, the fade object is still sitting in this room, even though it's doing nothing. And that's not great. So we want to just get rid of it. So once it's transitioned into the second room, we'll just destroy the instance of that object. So how do we know if the object is ready to be destroyed? Well, the opacity is going to be 0 because it's faded back down. So we can just check to see if the opacity is 0 with an if statement. If opacity is 0, instance destroy. So this will destroy the fade object whenever we're done with it. And just to make sure we can test, because obviously it's a bit hard to tell whether we've gotten rid of it because it's invisible. So we can show a message and say that the object fade has been destroyed. And that will just allow us to make sure that this code actually gets run. So we'll test that now. Brilliant. So now once this message has popped up, the object is no longer in the background. With a check like this, however, you have to be a little bit careful because whenever we create the object, we've set the opacity to 0 here. So there might be a circumstance, depending on your code, where you create the event and then you immediately destroy it, which is not what you want. So one way to prevent that from happening is to just make sure that your order is correct. The reason that that doesn't happen here is because we've increased opacity here, so it's more than 0. And down here we're checking to see if it's equal to 0. But if you want to make it a little bit more reliable, we can create another variable that checks to make sure that it's gone through the process of fading in and then fading out, and then it will be destroyed. And that would mean that it doesn't matter where in your code you have this if statement, it's always going to work. So I'll quickly show how you would implement that. We'll create the variable in the create event, and let's call it, it's ready to destroy. And whenever you create the object, you want that to be false. It's not ready to be destroyed. And then in the draw event, whenever you have faded up the opacity to 1, that's when you want to change ready to destroy to true. Because you've gone halfway, you've transitioned into the next room. You're not destroying it here, but you can set it to be ready to destroy. So ready to destroy equals true. And then in your if statement down here, where you're checking to see if the opacity is 0, you can also check for the ready to destroy. So if opacity is 0 and ready to destroy, then you will destroy the object. And I will cut this and I'll put it up here, and then you'll be able to see when we test it that it now works just the same as it did before. Nice. But if I got rid of this check for the ready to destroy, and we were just looking for the opacity, it's going to instantly destroy the object, and you'll just be stuck in the first room. See, it's destroyed it before it's even got a chance to open. So I'm going to just paste that back down here. So that's all you need to know to make the transition. The next couple of things I'll do is just like a little bit of polish and how you could actually use this effectively in a game. So the first bit of polish that I want to do is in between the transition, it will pause while the screen is black and display some text. For example, it can say like next level, and then it will proceed to go into that level. And then after that, I want to show you a little example of a game where you can have the player run into the victory zone, and then the game can detect that and then transition into the next room by itself. But first, let's get to displaying some text in the middle of the transition. I'm gonna get rid of this show message as well, now that we have tested that and we know that it works, because we don't want that popping up every time we use the transition. And one more thing, whenever we change the alpha in a draw event, we want to make sure that we reset it back to 1 at the end of the event. Otherwise, everything else that we draw, so if there's other objects, anything like that, then they are also going to change their alpha. This alpha affects everything in your game, not just this one object. So just at the end of the event, I'm going to say draw set alpha back to 1. And this isn't going to affect the transition at all, because all of the logic is coming before and it's all saved in the variables. This is just going to make sure that no other objects in your game are also following this fade. So now I'm going to quickly add in some comments to make this just a little bit more readable. So up here we are increasing and decreasing the opacity. Over here, we are checking if we have fully faded in. And then down here, we're checking if we have fully faded out. So if we want to get some text showing in between the fade, what we want to do is whenever we have fully faded in here, we're going to set an alarm that counts down for as long as we want the text to display. And then once the alarm goes off, that's when we're going to run this code and then start fading out again. So let's get this alarm set up. So once we've fully faded in, we're going to say alarm 0 equals, and however long you want this to run in seconds, you just take room speed and multiply it by however many seconds you want it to run for. So let's say 2 seconds we want the text to be on the screen for. We'll say room speed multiplied by 2. Also, whenever we set this alarm and it's counting down, we don't want to keep resetting it to 2 seconds. We want to let it run down. So we will say if alarm 0 is less than 0. So what this means is that you are checking if the alarm is not already set. Whenever an alarm is not active, it will just sit at a value of -4. So that's why we can check if it's less than 0. And if it's less than 0, that means it's not running at the moment. So we will set up to start running here. And it will only run this once. I'm gonna just add some braces in here. You don't need them, but it looks a little bit nicer if you do add them in. Now, what we want to happen after the 2 seconds is to run this code. So we're going to put this code into the alarm. And we could put this code in the alarm too if we wanted, I guess. So I'm going to use Control X to cut this and then create or go into the alarm 0 and then just paste that code in here. So after 2 seconds, it's gonna call all of this. So we can test this, and basically what we're expecting is for it to fade to black, and then instead of fading out again immediately, it's just gonna hover black for a couple seconds. Like that. Which is nice by itself actually, but let's get some text displaying in there as well. So to do that, we're going to do a similar check to this one, except the opposite. We want to see if the alarm is more than 0 this time. And if it's more than 0, that means we're counting down the timer. And for as long as we're counting down the timer, we will display the text. If alarm 0 is more than 0. And here we can just use the draw text function. So let's say we want it in the middle of the room, so the X and Y be room width divided by 2 and room height divided by 2. And the text we want to display will be, say, level 2. Now, before we test this, we also need to change the color of the text, because currently we've set draw set color to black up here, which means that this text is also going to be black, but we don't want that. We want it to be, let's say, white. So we're going to draw set color to be C white, so we can actually see the text on the black background. Now let's test that. Excellent. The text looks a little bit crappy down there, so let's make that text look a little bit better. First thing, let's make a new font for the text. I'll call it font. I'm happy enough with it just being this Arial, that's fine. I'm going to turn this off, which will prevent the sort of blurry outline. And then I'm also going to just increase the size of it by whatever amount. Now let's go back into our object fade and set the font. Draw set font to font, which we've just called it. Some other things that didn't look very good was it wasn't center aligned in the middle of the screen. So to do that, we will use horizontal alignment and vertical alignment. So we will say draw set H align, and we want it to be center aligned, so we type FA font alignment center. And then we have to do the same thing for the vertical alignment. So draw set V align FA center. So we can test this again and it should all be looking much cleaner. Looks pretty good. One thing I'm going to change about this, instead of typing in the text here, I'm going to create a variable that stores the text that I want to print. So in the create event, I will say, I'll create a variable called my text equals level 2, and then change this whenever we're drawing the text, set the position, and then we will just put in my text. So this is going to run just the same as before, but what this allows us to do is customize the text a lot more easily. Looks good. So the last thing that I wanted to show is how you could actually use this in a game and have all the systems working together nicely. So I'm going to quickly make some sprites for a player, and he's just going to be a pink square. And I'm also going to make a sprite for the win zone. Okay, so this is going to be where you're running into to win your level. I'm going to make it much bigger, and I'm going to give it just be like one color, but I'm going to turn the opacity down some. And I want to call this SPR win zone. Now I need to create an object for both of those. Object player, and assign the sprite, and object win zone, and assign the sprite. So whenever the player runs into the win zone, whenever they collide with each other, they will create a fade object, and they will be able to customize the text in that object as well. So I'm going to quickly give the player some movement in his step event. It's going to be, I'm only going to have him move to the right just to test this. So we will say x plus equals keyboard check VK right. So the only control is the right arrow key, which lets him move to the right and then into the win zone. And then we will set up the collision with the win zone. And here we want to create the fade object. So we will say instance create layer X and Y, it doesn't matter where in the room the object is created. Now, the layer that we put it in is important. We actually want to create a new layer that is above everything else so that the fade occurs above every other object. So let's go into the room editor and create a new instance layer, and we'll call it transition. So that's going to be our transition layer, and whenever we create the fade object, we'll put it into this layer because it's above everything else. And I'm also going to make the transition layer in the second room as well, just to make sure that everything is running as intended. So let's go back to the player objects. So we're in the collision event with the win zone, and we were creating the fade object. So the layer we want to put it in is transition, and the object we want to make is object fade. Now we only want to create one object fade, so as soon as we've made one, we will delete the win zone layer so that we don't keep making loads of these. So we will use instance destroy other to get rid of the win zone that we're colliding with. And one last thing we can do to change the text in the fade object, we can use a with statement when we create this object like this, and then we will change my text, which was inside the fade object, and we can change it to, my text, we can change that to whatever we want. So before it was saying level 2, now we can change it to, let's say, next round. So the last thing to do before we test this is to actually put these objects into the room and to get rid of this fade object that we've spawned in. These are in the instances layer, and let's throw in a player, and this is the win zone here. So we will move our player always super slow. It's a bit awkward. And like that, you can see you can customize that text, and that's a bit more of a practical application of the fade transition. One last little thing before I go is you might want to have this win zone. You might not want it to be visible in the game. So what you can do is you can have it so whenever you create this object, it immediately turns itself invisible. But because you've assigned a sprite, you'll be able to use it and see it in the editor, but whenever you run the game, it'll be invisible. So all you have to do to make this win zone invisible is go into the create event and then immediately set the image alpha to be 0. And before I test this, I'm going to make the player a little bit faster. Where's his step event? So I'll just say that X moves by keyboard check right, multiplied by just a number, just so it's a bit quicker. So let's test, and you'll be able to see that the win zone is actually invisible to the player, but it still works. It's super smooth. Awesome. So I hope that's been useful, and I will see you in the next one.